Hello, hi there. This is Thekla Petridou, a YouTuber, psychologist and author, and this is my second video on my English language channel on YouTube. Today's subject is the trauma of narcissism. Psychological abuse exercised by narcissists is the main cause of trauma in my clinical experience. When I started my studies in psychology in 1993, there was little known about narcissism as a personality type. At the time, in the lessons of psychopathology, what we were taught was about narcissistic personality disorder, a personality disorder classified in the cluster B of personality disorders, and what we were taught was that narcissism in the form of narcissistic personality disorder was of rare incidence. Little have I known, or nothing have I known, about narcissism as a personality type. I was educated as a psychologist and as a therapist in the 90s and early 2000s. At that time, we just had started to understand the critical role that trauma plays in psychopathology. Psychology is a relatively new science which has started and originated in the late 1800s. Of course, we all know about Sigmund Freud, who is considered to be the father of psychology, a psychiatrist that experimented with theories and practice that led to the development of the new science of psychology. Psychology originated from psychiatry, philosophy, religion, and life. I remember now vaguely that about 18 years ago or 15 years ago, I gave a speech into an art gallery where people with philosophical and existential worries gathered with the title The Art of Psychotherapy. And there I explained my take on psychotherapy originating from ancient Greek philosophy, from religious tactics, and from psychiatry. It is a really new science, and as a new science, it has new developments on a very regular basis. As I said, I was educated as a psychologist and as a clinical and social psychologist. On the third year of our studies at the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki, we had to choose our orientation, and I chose clinical and social psychology. And later on, I was educated on several psychotherapeutic techniques. All of my studies and all of my psychotherapeutic education was really non-aware of narcissism as the main cause of trauma in people's lives. The essence of trauma was known. At that time, post-traumatic stress disorder was too much in fashion because it was a really new disorder in the 90s, in the 80s, which resulted from the studies of American psychologists on Vietnam War veterans. I remember when I started to exercise my profession as a technical advisor in court, the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder was one of the most common diagnoses that we used in civic law. Little did I know, nothing have I known about complex post-traumatic stress disorder, which is, according to my opinion, the future in psychopathology. Complex post-traumatic stress disorder is a new clinical entity which is listed on ICD-11 the diagnostic manual of World Health Organization, and we wait for it to be listed in the next edition of DSM. Complex post-traumatic stress disorder, according to my professional opinion and my personal opinion and my scientific opinion, is the key to understand most of what was called before neurosis, most of the common psychological disorders. Stress disorders, affective disorders, like anxiety disorders, like depressive disorders, all originate from the large pool of complex post-traumatic stress disorder. The way I understand Cptsd is that a person grows up and receives multiple psychological traumas through her upbringing. All this psychological trauma accumulates in the subconscious side of the brain. Children that are being brought up without any psychological care and any preventive psychological care, they grow up carrying huge bags of trauma in their memory, in their subconscious memory. Most of us suffer from complex post-traumatic stress disorder, Cptsd, without even acknowledging it. All this trauma that is accumulated in the subconscious mind of a person is not forgotten. It's just being repressed and has a life of its own. So every time that we have a trigger, anything that reminds us of one of our traumas, we have what is called an emotional flashback, not a mere memory flashback, as in PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, where people have memory flashbacks, they remember the traumatic event. In complex post-traumatic stress disorder, in Cptsd, people have emotional flashbacks, whereas they don't remember one of the traumatic events, but they remember the negative feelings they had, the acute negative feelings they had once they were traumatized. And what happens to the person with Cptsd once they are triggered is to have emotional dysregulation. Emotional dysregulation, according to my clinical experience, is the main cause of all major affective disorders. Anxiety disorders, depression disorders, mood disorders, etc. Phobias, panic attack disorders, etc. The title of this video is The Trauma of Narcissism. As I said earlier, in the later years, clinical psychologists, psychopathologists, and academics have started to identify a broader sense of narcissism in modern society. Lead researcher and author on this department is, of course, Dr. Ramani Dirvasula. In her books, and especially in her books, Do You Know Who I Am?, which I consider the Bible about narcissism, she identifies clearly narcissism as a personality type and not merely as a very rare personality disorder that belongs to cluster B. I believe, as a psychologist and as a therapist, that Dr. Ramani Dirvasula and people who follow her work, her fellow workers and fellow professionals, have opened the path to understand how narcissism in our societies, in our daily life, in our close relationships affects us in a traumatic way. Narcissism as a personality type is a plague in our era. We live amongst narcissists. During my professional route, and my personal route in the last 26 years that I finished my bachelor's and I started getting further education and exercise the profession of a psychologist and a therapist. I am an applied psychologist. I'm not a researcher. I'm not an academic. I came to this very powerful conclusion that people with abusive behaviors, people who abuse others psychologically, the subtle abuse of narcissistic personality types consists most of the trauma that is given to people. The main cause of trauma is narcissistic behavior. People get psychologically traumatized through relationships with narcissists. Of course, I'm not the first on the internet to talk about narcissism. There are thousands of channels, hundreds of thousands of videos about narcissism. But since this is my only second video on my YouTube channel in English, I have to give some description of what narcissistic personality type is. A person who develops a narcissistic personality type is someone who cares not, who doesn't care at all about the feelings and interests of other people. Lack of empathy is the main characteristic of narcissism as a personality trait and of people with narcissistic personality types. Lack of empathy. A very prominent drive for exercising power, psychological power over other people, and the very specific way of handling their negative emotions through other people. Narcissists, people with narcissistic personality type, are basically adult spoiled children. They are people who refused to suffer in order to mature. Dr. Scott Peck, a very prominent psychiatrist and author, wrote a very important piece of work, his book, People of the Lie, a book that came out in the 80s, and it referred to what later Dr. Ramaninder Vasula described as narcissistic personality type. Evil in psychology is described as narcissism. I have been trained to be an applied psychologist, and I've been trained to be a therapist and to help people understand themselves and understand what makes them unhappy and what makes them dysfunctional. Before I realized that narcissism is the number one enemy of mental health, I couldn't find a way to help people heal their trauma, love themselves, and be able to live a normal life. Most people do not realize that they have abusive relationships with family members, with friends, with lovers, with partners, even with coworkers. It is essential for anybody who tries to understand themselves, for anybody who wants to obtain psychological education or go to therapy, to realize what psychological abuse is. Psychological abuse is when somebody treats you in a hurtful way emotionally, psychologically, and spiritually. Emotional abuse comes from people with narcissistic behavior and narcissistic type of personalities. It is essential to realize that trauma is caused by people with evil intentions. Narcissists want to prevail, want to have an easy life, and they do not hesitate to use other people in order to achieve their goal. Other people who use could be their children, their spouses, their parents, their co-workers, their friends, anybody who is within reach. Narcissism is a natural trait in young children and teenagers. We can talk about a narcissistic personality type only when we talk about adults. And adulthood, through a psychological perspective, we are considered to be psychologically adults in our late 20s. Recent neuropsychological research has shown that the human brain is still developing until the age of 26 for women, at the age of 28 for men. Our frontal lobes are not fully developed until we reach the age of 26 if we are a biological female, or the age of 28 if we are a biological male. So, until the age of 26 and 28, we are considered to be teenagers, psychologically, because legally we are adults at an earlier age. So, a personality type can be fully developed only after the age our brain is fully developed. So, we anticipate, and it is natural for a young child, for a teenage child, to have narcissistic tendencies. It's only normal. It's only natural, because they are not yet fully developed in their brain, and they haven't learned yet all they need to learn in order to be psychologically, emotionally, and spiritually mature. So, people with narcissistic personality choose over and over again in their teenage years to remain children. They choose to remain immature. They choose to remain self-centered. Narcissism is all about self-admiration and eccentric self-love. It's a good thing to love yourself. Having a high self-esteem is something that we aim for in therapy. But having a distorted love of yourself, having a selfish and indifferent to other people's emotion persecution of your own joy without considering other people's emotions is a narcissistic trait, which again, I say it's only normal for children and teenagers, but it's not normal, it's not mature for adults. So when an adult acts, feels, and thinks like a child, when an adult believes herself to be the center not only of the world, of the universe, then we have a narcissist. And narcissists are especially focused on deriving pleasure and avoiding discomfort. In order to have all the pleasure you can get and avoid any discomfort you can have, you traumatize other people. You take advantage of other people. You use other people to handle your negative emotions. This is why narcissists have narcissistic rage. They tend to get extremely angry with no apparent reason, and they enjoy taking it out on other people. When you are unlucky enough to have a narcissistic parent, a narcissistic teacher, a narcissistic sibling, a narcissistic friend, a narcissistic partner, you get traumatized emotionally, psychologically, and spiritually on a daily basis, or every time you have any interaction with them. Relationships with narcissists are a continuous traumatic experience. Are you in a relationship with someone with a narcissistic personality type? Are you someone that suffers from their friends, parents, siblings, partners, co-workers, rage fits? Are you someone that you have come to a point that you feel emotionally dysregulated often as you interact with people in your life that we used in the past as toxic people? I had to grow up enough in order to read the book by Susan Forward with the title Toxic Parents, to read the book by Dr. Ramani, Do You Know Who I Am? And to learn all this new theory about narcissistic personalities in order to understand why me, myself, and the people I treated in the past, and the people that write emails to me with their personal stories, to understand why psychological trauma is so abundant in our lives. The reason is because nowadays it is in fashion to be a narcissist. I wouldn't like to go into the lengths of describing how materialistic society, how advertisements, how social media show and advertise narcissism as a desirable style of life. Being a narcissist is being rewarded by modern society. I had this friend who is an academic in math science who once told me, you shouldn't say in your Greek YouTube videos that narcissists live amongst us. You should point to the true fact that we live amongst narcissists. When I first listened to it, I was a little bit hesitant to believe it, but it is the truth. Narcissists are the main cause of psychological trauma to their friends, relatives, love partners, etc. Cptsd, complex post-traumatic stress disorder, is the main reason that people visit a therapist or search for psychological help. The main cause of trauma in our society is narcissists and narcissism. On this channel, we're gonna talk a lot more about narcissism and especially about ways to cope with narcissistic people in our lives and ways to raise our children, helping them not to become narcissists. I would love to read in the comments any suggestions on future video topics or any questions you have on today's topic. Thank you for watching. It's my pleasure to have you in my new channel. If you liked my video, please press the like button, share it with your friends on social media, and feel free to subscribe to my channel. Bye!